The night her father sold her future over roasted pheasant and good wine, Vivienne did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears were a luxury, visible, inconvenient, and entirely wasted on a man like Lord Ashford. So when her father rose from his chair at the head of the long dinner table, tapped his crystal glass with the quiet confidence of a man who believed he was doing something generous, and announced to 30 assembled guests that his eldest daughter was to be married to Sir Reginald Holt before the end of the season, Vivienne picked up her fork, cut her meat, and smiled. Not at her father, not at Sir Reginald, who was already nodding with the satisfied expression of a man inspecting a new acquisition. She smiled at no one in particular, at the middle distance, the way she had taught herself to do in rooms where her feelings were not invited. The polite applause moved around the table like a small, well-mannered wave. And then, from somewhere near the center of the table, came a sound that was not applause. A single, quiet click of crystal being set down on white linen. Vivienne did not look up immediately, but she felt it, the way one feels a door closing in a house that has suddenly gone still. When she finally raised her eyes, she found him already watching her. James Alderton, the Duke of Carwick. Dark coat, straight shoulders, an expression that gave nothing away and somehow, because of that, gave everything away. He was not looking at her father. He was not looking at Sir Reginald. He was looking at her hands, her fork, her careful smile, with the focused attention of a man who had just witnessed something he had not expected and was not yet sure what to do with it. Vivienne held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looked back down at her plate and took a precise, unhurried bite. She did not know then what that look meant. She did not know that he had come to that dinner with a purpose. She did not know that he was, at that exact moment, too late. She only knew that for the first time in a very long evening, someone at that table had looked at her as though she were a person rather than a problem to be arranged. It was, she would think later, a terrible moment to notice such a thing. Lord Ashford had always possessed the particular talent of men who cause damage, while appearing to do favors. He was charming at dinner tables. He remembered names, complimented wives, laughed at the right moments, and moved through drawing rooms with the ease of a man who had never once questioned whether he belonged. His debts were enormous and his confidence was larger still, and for most of Vivienne's 24 years, she had watched him spend both without apparent concern. The engagement to Sir Reginald Holt had not been discussed with her. Not once, not in passing, not even as a suggestion floated gently over morning tea. It had been decided the way her father decided most things, in a room she was not in, with people whose interests did not include hers, and presented to her as a conclusion rather than a question. She had suspected something was coming. There had been signs, if one knew how to read her father. The new coat he couldn't afford. The way he had laughed too loudly at Sir Reginald's jokes at the Pemberton gathering last month. The careful, deliberate way he had not mentioned any of it to her. Lord Ashford only became careful when he was guilty of something. But suspicion, she had learned, was not the same as preparation. When he stood and tapped his glass that evening, Vivienne's first sensation was not shock. It was something colder and more precise. The recognition that she had known this was possible and had not moved quickly enough to prevent it. Her second sensation was the acute awareness of 30 pairs of eyes turning toward her face. She gave them nothing. She had been practicing that particular skill since she was 12 years old, standing in this same dining room while her father introduced her stepmother to the assembled household, as though Vivienne's own mother had simply evaporated rather than died. She had stood still then. She stood still now. Sir Reginald Holt was 51 years old. He had been married once before. His first wife had died under circumstances that polite society described as unfortunate, and impolite society described with considerably more specificity. He was wealthy, well-connected, and possessed of the quiet, settled arrogance of a man who had never been told no by anyone whose opinion he valued. He had looked at Vivienne across various drawing rooms for the better part of 2 seasons with an expression she recognized and disliked intensely. She had never imagined her father would actually do it. She raised her glass. She said, quietly enough that only those nearest to her could hear, that she was very grateful for her father's care on her behalf. The words tasted like nothing. She had learned to say things that tasted like nothing. The applause was brief and well-intentioned, and meant absolutely nothing. Across the table, she was aware, without looking directly, that the Duke of Carwick had not joined it. She knew who he was, of course. Everyone in the county knew who he was. James Alderton had inherited the dukedom at 22, managed it with a seriousness that apparently surprised people who had known his father, and moved through society with the reserved self-possession of a man who had decided early that he did not particularly need its approval. He was spoken of with the mixture of respect and speculation that tends to follow unmarried men of significant consequence. And he had, so far as Vivienne had observed, paid it absolutely no attention. He had been to her father's house twice before. She had been present both times. He had been perfectly courteous, perfectly correct, and had not, to her recollection, directed more than a handful of sentences toward her specifically. She had not minded, or rather, she had minded in the way she minded most things she could not change, which was to say quietly, privately, and without visible effect. She did not look at him again for the rest of dinner. But she was aware, with the particular peripheral precision she had developed over years of monitoring rooms for danger, that he did not resume his conversation for quite some time after her father sat back down. And that when the evening ended and the guests filed into the entrance hall for their coats and carriages, the Duke of Carwick paused at the door, turned back once as though he had forgotten something, and scanned the room until she was almost certain his eyes found her. She was already looking at the floor. She did not know what he had been looking for. She did not know that he had come to that dinner intending to speak privately to her father before the evening was out, to make a formal and serious inquiry, through proper channels, about the possibility of being introduced to her with a specific purpose in mind. She did not know that he had arrived 20 minutes late, taken his seat, and found the entire matter already concluded. She did not know any of this. She only knew that Sir Reginald Holt had taken her hand at the end of the evening with a proprietary firmness that turned her stomach, and that her father had watched it happen with the satisfied expression of a man who had resolved a problem. Vivienne had walked upstairs alone, sat on the edge of her bed in the dark, and thought, with the methodical calm she applied to all disasters, about what exactly she still had left. She thought about her mother's Bible, sitting in the bottom of the old trunk at the end of the hall. She thought about the letter tucked inside it. And she thought, briefly and without quite meaning to, about the sound of a crystal glass being set down on white linen, quiet, deliberate, in the middle of a room full of noise. Then she put the thought away and went to find a candle. Sir Reginald Holt began appearing at the house 3 days after the dinner. He did not ask if it was convenient. He simply arrived, at 11 in the morning, at 2 in the afternoon, once at 9:30 with a bouquet of flowers so large it required 2 hands to carry and served, Vivienne suspected, less as a romantic gesture than as a demonstration of what he could afford. He would settle himself in the best chair in the drawing room, accept tea with the expectation of someone who had already decided the house was partly his, and speak to Vivienne in the measured, instructive tone of a man, explaining things to someone who had not yet had the benefit of his guidance. He had opinions about everything: the way she arranged the flowers on the mantelpiece, the books she kept on the side table, too serious, he said, for a drawing room, the color of her dress one Tuesday morning which he described as severe. He delivered these observations without malice, which somehow made them worse. Malice could be argued with. This was simply the steady, patient correction of a man who had already decided who she was going to become. Vivienne listened. She responded in the brief, pleasant tones she had perfected over years of managing her father's dinner guests. She did not argue. She did not agree. She offered nothing that could be used. At night alone, she pressed her hands flat against her dressing table and breathed slowly until the tightness in her chest became manageable again. Her stepmother, Catherine, was in excellent spirits. Catherine Ashford had married Vivienne's father 7 years ago with the pragmatic efficiency of a woman making the best available arrangement. She was not cruel in any dramatic or obvious sense. She was simply and consistently indifferent to anything that did not directly affect her own comfort, which produced, in practice, much the same result. She had 2 daughters of her own, younger than Vivienne, prettier in the conventional sense, and entirely untroubled by the kind of thoughts that made Vivienne difficult to manage. Since the engagement announcement, Catherine had become almost warm. She complimented Vivienne's hair at breakfast. She suggested they go together to look at dress fabric. She spoke of Sir Reginald with the satisfied familiarity of a woman who had known about the arrangement considerably longer than Vivienne had. It was this last detail that Vivienne noted most carefully. She began to pay closer attention. She watched the way Catherine looked when Reginald's name was mentioned, not with the mild approval of a stepmother pleased with a match, but with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had negotiated something and received what she asked for. She watched the way her father avoided her eyes at breakfast. She watched the small, quiet exchanges, a look across the table, a letter that disappeared from the hall table before Vivienne could see who it was addressed to. She was patient. She had always been patient. It was the one advantage available to someone in her position, the ability to wait quietly while other people revealed themselves. The revelation came on a Wednesday, in the form of an unlocked writing desk. Catherine had gone out for the afternoon. Her father was at his club. Vivienne had not gone looking. She had simply gone into the small sitting room off the main hall to retrieve a book she had left there, and the desk had been open, and the letter on top had been face up, and the handwriting had been Reginald's. She did not take it. She did not touch it. She read it where it lay, standing very still in the afternoon light, with the particular focused calm of someone receiving information they had already half suspected. The letter was not long. It did not need to be. In 3 short paragraphs, Sir Reginald confirmed the terms of a private arrangement he had made with Catherine, a quarterly sum, beginning after the wedding, in exchange for her continued support of the match and her management of any resistance from the bride. The word resistance appeared in the letter with quotation marks around it, as though it were a charming eccentricity rather than a reasonable response to being sold. Vivienne straightened up. She walked back through the hall, up the stairs, and into her own room. She sat down. Then she got up again, went to the trunk at the end of the corridor, and took out her mother's Bible. She had known the deed was there. She had known it in the vague, unexamined way one knows things that have not yet become urgent. Her mother had shown it to her once, years ago, pressed her small hand against the folded paper and said, very quietly, that this belonged to Vivienne and always would, regardless of what anyone else decided. Vivienne had been 10 years old. She had not entirely understood. She had not forgotten. She unfolded it now at her writing table, in the thin afternoon light, and read it carefully from beginning to end. The property was modest. A small house and several acres in the neighboring county, held in her mother's name and passed directly to Vivienne upon her mother's death. It was not grand. It was not profitable in any significant sense. But it was hers, entirely and legally, and it had nothing to do with her father's finances or Sir Reginald's expectations or Catherine's quarterly arrangement. Or so she believed, until she read the second document tucked behind the deed. It was a promissory note. Her father's signature at the bottom, she knew it immediately, the slightly uneven loop of the A in Ashford. The property had been pledged as collateral against a debt. The debt was substantial. The creditor listed at the top of the document was the estate of the Duke of Carwick. Vivienne sat with this for a long moment. Her father had pledged property that was not his. He had used her inheritance, her mother's inheritance. As security against money, he had borrowed from a man who had sat across a dinner table from her 6 days ago and set down his glass. She folded both documents carefully and placed them back inside the Bible. Then she put on her coat and went to find a solicitor. She chose one 2 towns over, on the recommendation of a housemaid whose cousin had used him in a property matter and found him discreet. She gave her name as Miss V. Marsh, her mother's maiden name, and explained the situation in the plainest possible terms. The solicitor, a careful man of middle age named Mr. Foss, listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment in the way of someone choosing words. The property, he confirmed, was legally hers. The pledge her father had made against it was, at minimum, highly irregular and possibly void. However, he said, the matter was complicated by the identity of the creditor. Vivienne waited. Mr. Foss explained that the Duke of Carwick was not an easy creditor to simply redirect. His estate was managed with considerable legal rigor. Any challenge to the promissory note would attract attention, significant attention, of the kind that would be difficult to conduct quietly. And then he said the thing that made Vivienne go very still. He said that the Duke had not pressed the claim, that it had been outstanding for nearly 3 years, and that in all that time, the Duke's solicitors had made no move to collect. That he had, in fact, received 2 separate requests for extension from Lord Ashford's office, and had granted both without apparent objection. That this was, Mr. Foss paused here, looking slightly uncertain, not typical behavior for an estate of that size and that level of legal organization. Vivienne thanked him. She paid his fee. She walked out into the gray afternoon and stood on the pavement for a moment before she began the walk back to the coaching inn. She thought about a man who was owed a significant debt and had quietly, repeatedly, chosen not to collect it. She thought about a man who had arrived at a dinner party with an apparent purpose and left without accomplishing it. She thought about the sound of a glass being set down in a quiet room. She did not allow herself to draw conclusions. Conclusions, she had found, were dangerous when one wanted them too much. She filed the information away instead, carefully, alongside the deed and the promissory note and the letter she had read in Catherine's sitting room. Then she went home, went upstairs, and rode out early the following morning before anyone else in the house was awake. She had not intended to go in the direction of Carwick Land. She had simply ridden, the way she always did when she needed to think, and the road had taken her along the eastern boundary of the Duke's estate, the long stone wall running parallel to the bridle path, the oaks beginning to turn at the top of the ridge. She heard the horse before she saw the rider. He came around the bend at an easy pace, alone, without a groom. He saw her at the same moment she saw him. Neither of them pulled up dramatically. They simply arrived at the same stretch of path at the same time and slowed to a natural stop. The Duke of Carwick looked at her in the early morning light with an expression that was carefully arranged and not, she thought, entirely successful. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. They were, for a moment, simply 2 people on a road in the early autumn quiet, their horses standing close enough that she could see the slight tension in his jaw and the way he was looking at her. Not as Sir Reginald looked at her, measuring and possessive, but with a focused, searching attention that she could not immediately categorize. He asked if she rode this way often. She said she did when she needed air. He said that he found the eastern boundary particularly good for that purpose. She said she could see why. It was, in every measurable sense, an entirely unremarkable conversation. It lasted perhaps 4 minutes. They parted with polite nods and rode in opposite directions. But Vivienne was aware, for the entire ride home, of a warmth somewhere below her sternum that she had absolutely no intention of examining. She had a deed, a promissory note, a fraudulent engagement, and a stepmother on a quarterly retainer. She could not afford warmth. She told herself this firmly twice, and then a third time for good measure. It did not entirely work. The second visit to Mr. Foss happened on a Thursday, 12 days after the first. Vivienne had spent those 12 days being measured for a wedding dress she did not intend to wear, smiling at a man she did not intend to marry, and conducting, in the quiet hours between obligations, a methodical review of everything she actually knew versus everything she had merely assumed. The distinction mattered. She had learned this from her mother, who had been a precise and unsentimental woman beneath her warmth, the kind of woman who kept her own records, filed her own correspondence, and trusted her own handwriting over anyone else's word. Vivienne had inherited the habit, if not always the opportunity, to practice it. What she knew, the deed was legally hers. The promissory note was her father's signature on her mother's property. The engagement had been arranged at least partly to manage a social and financial situation her father had created without her knowledge. Catherine had been compensated for her cooperation. The Duke had not pressed his claim in 3 years. What she had assumed, that the debt was still outstanding, that her mother's property had been genuinely lost, that she had no options. It was the second assumption she had begun to doubt. Her mother had been, in Vivienne's memory, a woman of careful habits and no illusions about her husband. She had shown Vivienne the deed when Vivienne was 10. She had said it always would be hers. She had not said anything about a debt, and her mother, Vivienne was quite certain, would have said something about a debt. She went back to the trunk. She had searched it thoroughly the first time, or so she had believed. This time she took everything out: the Bible, the letters bundled in faded ribbon, the 2 small journals she had never been able to bring herself to read, a velvet box containing her mother's garnets, a folded square of embroidery that she recognized as the pillowcase her mother had been working on the winter she died. She laid everything on the floor around her, sitting cross-legged in the corridor in the early morning quiet, and went through each item with the patience of someone who suspected the answer was there if she was willing to look carefully enough. It was in the second journal. Not the debt itself, but a record of the payment. 3 lines in her mother's small, even handwriting, dated 14 months before she died. The amount matched the promissory note exactly. The recipient was listed as the estate of the late Duke of Carwick, the current Duke's father. And at the bottom of the entry in the margin, her mother had written 4 words that Vivienne read 3 times before she let herself believe them. Settled in full, receipt kept. Vivienne sat very still on the floor of the corridor for quite a long time. Then she went back through the trunk until she found it, tucked inside the velvet box beneath the garnets, folded so small it was nearly invisible. A formal receipt, signed and dated, from the Duke of Carwick's estate solicitor. The debt her father had pledged her property against had been repaid in full by her mother, 14 months before her mother died. Her father had known. He had to have known. He had access to all of her mother's papers after her death. He had seen the journals, the correspondence, the financial records. He had taken what he wanted and left what didn't suit him, and what hadn't suited him was the knowledge that the debt was gone and the property was free and clear and entirely beyond his reach. He had pledged it anyway, to a man whose own father had already been paid. Vivienne put the receipt in her coat pocket. She put everything else back in the trunk. She went downstairs, ate breakfast with the composure of someone who was not, beneath the surface, vibrating with a cold and focused fury, and told Catherine she was going into the village to look at glove fabric. She went to see Mr. Foss instead. He read the journal entry and the receipt twice. Then he set them down on his desk and looked at Vivienne over his spectacles with an expression she could not quite read, something between professional caution and something warmer, more personal. He said carefully that this changed the situation considerably. She said she had rather thought it might. He said that the promissory note her father had signed was fraudulent. He had pledged an asset against a debt that no longer existed, to a creditor whose predecessor had already been paid. He said that the current Duke of Carwick's estate, when informed of this, would almost certainly have no legal claim on the property whatsoever and might in fact be entitled to pursue Lord Ashford for the fraudulent pledge itself. Vivienne asked him to be specific about one point. She asked whether, in his professional opinion, the Duke of Carwick was aware of his father's receipt. Mr. Foss was quiet for a moment. Then he said that estate records of that kind were generally transferred in full to an heir, that a well-managed estate, and the Duke of Carwick's was, by all accounts, extremely well managed, would have complete records of all settled debts, that it was, in his view, highly unlikely that the current Duke was unaware. Vivienne looked at the receipt on his desk. So the Duke, she said slowly, already knew the debt was paid. Mr. Foss nodded. He had a fraudulent promissory note against property that was legally hers, she continued, and he had chosen not to use it and not to expose it. Mr. Foss nodded again, more carefully this time. For 3 years, she said. The solicitor removed his spectacles and polished them with the deliberate attention of a man giving someone space to think. He said that he could not speak to the Duke's motivations. He said that legally, the path forward was relatively clear. The property could be formally restored to her, the fraudulent pledge could be challenged, and her engagement to Sir Reginald, which appeared to have been arranged partly on the basis of a debt that did not exist, would lose much of its structural foundation. He said all of this with the measured precision of a man discussing legal mechanisms. What he did not say, but what hung in the small office like afternoon light through dusty glass, was the obvious question, the question Vivienne had been turning over since she walked in. Why had the Duke said nothing? She did not ask it aloud. She thanked Mr. Foss, arranged for him to begin the preliminary paperwork quietly, and asked him with some emphasis to be extremely discreet. He said he would be. She believed him. She walked back through the village with the receipt in her pocket, and the cold October air against her face, and the question she hadn't asked sitting at the front of her mind like a guest who had not been invited and showed no sign of leaving. A man with a fraudulent claim he had chosen not to press. A man who had arrived at a dinner party with an apparent purpose. A man who had found her on a bridle path at 7 in the morning and asked whether she rode there often. She was not going to draw conclusions. She was absolutely not going to draw conclusions. She drew 3 of them immediately, and spent the entire walk home dismantling each one with the systematic care of someone who could not afford to be wrong. Sir Reginald came to the house that afternoon. He was in good spirits, which meant he was more expansive than usual, more inclined to fill the room with himself. He brought with him a copy of the marriage settlement he wished to propose, a document he placed on the drawing-room table with the satisfied air of someone presenting a gift, and talked for 20 minutes about its terms, while Vivienne sat with her hands folded and her face arranged in an expression of polite attention. The terms were not generous. They were not intended to be. The settlement was structured to ensure that everything Vivienne brought to the marriage became immediately and entirely his, with a monthly allowance for her personal expenses that was described in the document as comfortable, and that she privately assessed as insulting. There was no provision for separate property. There was no provision for anything, really, except the quiet conversion of a person into an asset. She did not say any of this. She said she would need to review it with her father. Reginald said, with the patient benevolence of a man explaining something obvious, that her father had already seen it and was very pleased. Of course he was, she thought. After Reginald left, she sat alone in the drawing room for a few minutes. Outside the window, the light was going. The garden looked gray and a little skeletal, the roses cut back for winter, the lawn going damp. She thought about a small house in the neighboring county. She thought about what it would mean to have somewhere to go that was entirely, legally, undeniably her own. Not grand, not profitable, but hers. She thought about a man who had known, for 3 years, that she had been wronged, and had done nothing with that knowledge except, apparently, not make it worse. She still wasn't drawing conclusions. But she thought for just a moment about the weight of a glass being set down with particular care on a white linen tablecloth. The sound of someone deciding, very quietly, to pay attention. Then she stood up, went upstairs and wrote 2 letters. One to Mr. Foss, confirming the instructions she had given him that morning. And one that she did not send, that she wrote and rewrote and finally folded and put in the drawer of her writing table without addressing, which began, in her mother's small, even hand that she had unconsciously imitated since childhood. Your Grace, I believe we may have something to discuss. She left it in the drawer. She was not ready. She needed to be sure of her ground before she moved, and her ground was still shifting, and there were still things she did not know. But she did not throw it away. The book had been sitting on her conscience for 2 weeks. It was a slim volume of agricultural philosophy, an unlikely thing for her father to have borrowed, and yet there it was, tucked behind the larger books on the study shelf with her father's careless habit of shelving things spine inward, so he wouldn't have to look at titles he hadn't read. She had found it while searching for her mother's correspondence files and recognized the crest embossed on the cover immediately. She had seen that crest on a promissory note. She had seen it on a receipt. She knew whose library it had come from. It was a small thing, a borrowed book, unreturned for what she suspected was several years. In the ordinary course of events, it would mean nothing. Gentlemen borrowed each other's books constantly, and returned them eventually or not at all without social consequence either way. But Vivienne needed a reason. A clean, unimpeachable, entirely unremarkable reason to appear at the Duke of Carwick's door without anyone, including herself, being able to attach significance to it. A borrowed book was exactly that. She told Catherine she was returning a library volume that had been mislaid in the study. Catherine, who was occupied with her own correspondence and a particularly absorbing discussion of dress trimmings with her eldest daughter, waved a hand without looking up. Vivienne took the book, put on her coat, and ordered the small carriage. Carwick House was not, as grand estates went, aggressively imposing. It had the settled confidence of a place that had been well maintained across several generations. Stone gone soft gray with age, windows that caught the morning light cleanly, grounds that were neat without being theatrical. It looked like a house where things worked properly. Vivienne had always found that more impressive than grandeur. The housekeeper received her in the entrance hall with the careful courtesy extended to a caller of ambiguous social position, polite but measuring. Vivienne gave her name, offered the book, and said she wished simply to return it with her father's apologies for the delay. The housekeeper said she would inform the Duke that Miss Ashford had called. Vivienne said that was entirely unnecessary. She did not wish to disturb. The housekeeper said she was quite sure His Grace would wish to know. There was a brief pause in which both women understood that the conversation had been decided, and then Vivienne was shown to a sitting room that smelled of old books and wood smoke, and something she couldn't identify that was nonetheless immediately and inexplicably calming. She waited 4 minutes. She knew because she counted. He came in without announcement, which surprised her slightly. She had expected the formal punctuation of a door opened by a servant, a moment of arranged entrance. Instead, he simply appeared in the doorway in his shirt sleeves with his coat evidently located and put on in some haste, which told her he had been working and had not expected a caller, and had come anyway faster than propriety strictly required. She found this information useful in a way she did not examine. He said good morning, she said good morning, she held out the book. He took it, looked at the cover, and then looked at her with an expression that was doing a great deal of careful work. He said he had wondered where that had gone. She said her father had a talent for absorbing things that belonged to other people. It came out more precisely than she had intended. She saw something move through his eyes quickly, not quite suppressed, that might have been amusement or might have been recognition. He gestured toward the chairs by the window and she sat, because declining would have been more conspicuous than accepting. He sat across from her, not behind the desk, beside the fireplace, the same level, the same distance as a conversation between equals. She noticed this. She noticed that she noticed it. For a moment neither of them spoke, and the silence was not uncomfortable in the way silences usually were in rooms where she was present on sufferance. It was a different kind of silence, the kind that preceded something. He asked then, without preamble and without looking away from her face, how she was finding the engagement. The question was so direct that she nearly answered it honestly before she caught herself. She said she was finding it as expected. He said that was not what he had asked. She looked at him, he looked back. The fire made a small sound. She said, after a moment, that she had learned some time ago that quiet acceptance and quiet resistance looked identical from across a dinner table. That most people found this convenient and did not look more closely. She said it the way she had said it to herself, in the privacy of her own thoughts, which meant she said it more plainly than she had intended. He was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough to feel considered. Then he said, carefully, that he imagined it required a great deal of energy, maintaining an expression that served everyone's comfort except one's own. She said it became habitual. He said he didn't think it should have to. It was a simple sentence, 4 words and a contraction. She had no idea what to do with it, and so she looked at her hands, which were folded in her lap with the trained composure of a woman who had spent years keeping them still when they wanted to do something else. She said, after a moment, that she appreciated the sentiment. He said it was not a sentiment, it was an observation. She looked up at that. He was watching her with the same focused attention she had catalogued at the dinner table, not the attention of a man evaluating a woman, but of a man trying to understand something that mattered to him. The distinction was one she had rarely encountered and could not immediately categorize. She said, to redirect them both towards safer ground, that she hoped the book would be useful. He glanced down at it in his hands as though he had forgotten it was there. He said his father had been very fond of it, that it had been one of several things that had made their way to neighboring houses over the years and not returned. She said she was sorry it had taken so long. He said he was glad it came back at all. Another pause. Outside the window the park stretched away in the pale November light, the oaks stripped back, the sky a flat and even gray. It was not a romantic scene. It was simply a Tuesday in late autumn, and she was sitting in a chair across from a man she had no business thinking about, and the fire was warm, and she recognized this with some alarm, entirely comfortable. She stood up. He stood immediately after, the automatic courtesy of a man well trained, but done with enough speed that it felt like something more than training. She said she had taken enough of his time. He said she had taken no time at all. She said she hoped the agricultural philosophy proved useful. He said, with the very slight and very controlled quality that she was beginning to recognize as his version of humor, that he would endeavor to find it instructive. She smiled, not the dinner party smile, not the careful diplomatic nothing smile, but an actual one, brief and involuntary, gone almost before it arrived. She saw him see it. She said good morning and walked out before anything else could happen. The carriage ride home was 20 minutes. She spent the first 5 of them being extremely sensible about everything. She spent the remaining 15 failing completely. The man had a fraudulent claim on her property that he had not used. He had come to her father's dinner party with a stated purpose he had not accomplished. He had sought her out on a bridle path and asked whether she rode there often. He had come downstairs in a hastily located coat and sat across from her like an equal and told her, with no particular ceremony, that her life should not be the way it was. She was not drawing conclusions. She was, however, no longer actively dismantling them either. That evening, James Alderton sat at his writing desk for a long time with a blank sheet of paper in front of him. He had rehearsed this letter. He had composed it, revised it, set it aside, returned to it. He knew what he wanted to say. He had known since the dinner party, or before it, if he was honest with himself, which he was making a concerted effort to be. He was a man who made decisions methodically. He gathered information, assessed situations, acted when he was certain. He had been certain about very few things in the past several years, and moderately certain about this for approximately 6 weeks, and absolutely certain since this morning, when she had walked into his sitting room with a borrowed book and a smile she hadn't meant to let him see. He picked up his pen. He wrote for 20 minutes without stopping, which was unusual for him. Then he read it back. Then he sealed it before he could revise it further and rang for his man and told him to have it delivered to Ashford House by morning. The letter was formal and correct and said, in the careful language of a man who had chosen every word with some precision, that he hoped Miss Ashford might do him the honor of permitting him to call on her with a specific purpose, that he wished to speak to her father formally and with her prior knowledge and consent, which he believed was the correct order of operations, and that he remained, with considerable sincerity, her most respectful servant. He did not sleep particularly well, but he woke the following morning with the specific alertness of a man who had made a decision he did not intend to unmake, and he dressed and went downstairs and ate breakfast and waited with the disciplined patience of someone who was, beneath the patience, not patient at all. The reply did not come that day. It did not come the following day either. On the 3rd morning he told himself this was entirely normal. Letters were delayed. Households were busy. She might be considering her response carefully, which was only reasonable. On the 4th morning his secretary informed him, with the careful neutrality of a man delivering unwelcome information, that there was no record of the letter having been refused or returned. On the 5th morning James Alderton stood at the window of his study and looked out at the gray November park and considered the various explanations for silence, and found that most of them concerned him considerably. He did not yet know about Catherine Ashford's habit of collecting correspondence from the front hall before the housemaid could sort it. He did not yet know that his letter was sitting at the bottom of a locked drawer in Catherine's writing desk, unopened. He knew only that he had written and received nothing, and that Vivienne Ashford was engaged to a man he would not trust with a borrowed book, and that something was wrong in a way he could not yet see clearly enough to address. He went back to his desk. He began methodically to think. It began on a Friday, which Vivienne would later think was appropriate. Fridays had always had a particular quality in her father's house, a loosening of the week's careful management, a sense that the structure holding everything in place had gone slightly slack. Bad things tended to happen on Fridays. Sir Reginald arrived at 10 in the morning without sending word ahead. This was not unusual. What was unusual was that he did not go to the drawing room. He asked the housemaid, with the quiet authority of a man who considered himself already in residence, to tell Miss Ashford he wished to speak with her privately in the study. Vivienne received this message in her room, where she was writing a letter to Mr. Foss. She folded the letter, put it in her pocket, and went downstairs with her hands loose at her sides and her face arranged in its customary nothing. Reginald was standing at the window when she entered. He did not turn immediately. This was a technique, she had catalogued it over the weeks of his visits, designed to establish that his time was the important time, that she had been summoned into his attention rather than the reverse. She had seen her father use the same technique with tradesmen. She sat down without being invited to, which she knew he disliked. He turned then. He was holding something. She recognized it before she could stop the recognition from reaching her face, the slight involuntary attention of someone seeing a thing they had believed safely hidden. It was a copy, not the original, which was still with Mr. Foss, but a copy in her own handwriting that she had made for her own reference and kept in the false bottom of her writing box. The writing box which had been in her room, which was locked. She looked at the copy in his hand, and then at his face, and kept her own face still with an effort that cost her considerably. He said, conversationally, that he had found it very interesting reading. She said nothing. He said he could see she had been industrious, that she had clearly spent some time investigating what he called, with a small, patient smile, certain family financial arrangements, that he understood this impulse, particularly in a woman of her intelligence, that he was not, he wanted her to know, angry. The way he said not angry communicated that anger was the least of what was available to him. He sat down across from her and placed the copy on the table between them with the deliberate care of a man laying down a card. He said he wanted to be straightforward with her, which he said with the specific warmth of a man who was about to be anything but. He said that the property matter she had uncovered was, legally speaking, complicated. That lawyers could argue it in various directions for various amounts of time. That he had, as it happened, his own legal counsel who was very experienced at arguing such things in the direction he preferred. He said that the wedding was in 6 weeks. He said that he would prefer it to proceed smoothly and pleasantly, as he was sure she would too. And then he said, still conversationally, still with that patient and terrible reasonableness, that he had prepared a written account of certain events, a letter, addressed to several of the most active correspondents in the county's social network, which described in some detail a pattern of behavior on Vivienne's part that he characterized as unstable, deceptive, and indicative of a disordered character. He said the letter contained specific incidents, some of which had occurred and some of which had not, but which were described with enough particularity that the distinction would be difficult to establish. He said that a woman with that reputation would find her options considerably reduced, that her father's position would be affected, that any legal challenge she attempted would be assessed by people who had already been given reasons to doubt her credibility. He said he hoped, very sincerely, that none of this would be necessary. He said he simply needed the original deed, and the receipt returned to her father's files, and a conversation with her father confirming that she was proceeding with the wedding willingly and without reservation. Then he stood, picked up the copy, and said he would expect her answer by Sunday. He left without waiting for a response, which was, she understood the point. Vivienne sat in the study for 11 minutes after he left. She knew because the clock on the mantelpiece was loud in the silence, and she counted the quarter hour, and then most of the next one. She was not, she discovered, frightened. She was something colder and more focused than frightened, the specific mental state that arrived when a situation became serious enough that emotion became a luxury she simply couldn't process yet. She would be frightened later, probably. For now there was only the problem, and the problem had several components, and she needed to think about them in order. She had the original deed and the receipt. They were with Mr. Foss. Reginald did not know about Mr. Foss. She was reasonably certain of this, because if he had known about Mr. Foss he would have mentioned it. She had the journal entry in her mother's handwriting. She had not given this to Mr. Foss. She had kept it herself in the Bible in the trunk. She needed to move it. She had 6 weeks before the wedding. She had a letter she had written and never sent, sitting in her writing table drawer. She thought about that letter for a moment. Then she set the thought aside, because the letter required a clarity of action she was not yet ready to commit to, and there were more immediate things to manage first. She went upstairs. She changed her coat. She told the housemaid she was going to visit a friend in the village and would be back by 4. She was halfway down the stairs when her stepmother appeared in the entrance hall below her. Catherine was holding Vivienne's mail. This was not, in itself, unusual. Catherine had always managed the household correspondence with the proprietary efficiency of a woman who considered information a resource and access to it a privilege she dispensed selectively. What was unusual was the particular quality of her expression, not the vague indifference she typically aimed at Vivienne, but something sharper and more deliberate, something that had been decided. Catherine said that she had been speaking with Sir Reginald. Vivienne said she understood. Catherine said that she hoped Vivienne was going to be sensible. Vivienne looked at her stepmother, at the careful arrangement of her face, the controlled pleasantness that covered the calculation beneath, and felt, for a moment, something almost like pity, not for Catherine's position, which she had chosen and maintained with considerable shrewdness, but for the smallness of it, the careful management of a small kingdom built on other people's disadvantage. She said she was always sensible. Catherine said good. Then she said, as though it were an afterthought, that she had taken the liberty of letting the housemaid go for the afternoon, that she had also asked Thomas, the stable boy, to leave the horses in the paddock until she specifically requested them, that she thought it might be pleasant for Vivienne to have a quiet afternoon at home. The entrance hall was very still. Vivienne understood that she was not going to the village. She went back upstairs. She heard the key turn in the lock at the bottom of the servants' stair, Catherine being thorough, and sat down on her bed and looked at the ceiling and breathed. She was not frightened. She was, however, alone in a locked house with her options narrowing, a deadline of Sunday, and a letter in her writing table that was addressed to no one and said, "Your Grace, I believe we may have something to discuss." She got up. She went to the writing table. She took out the letter and read it. Then she took a fresh sheet and wrote a new one, shorter, plainer, stripped of everything except the essential facts: the deed, the receipt, the fraudulent pledge, the legal situation as Mr. Foss had described it. She did not mention Reginald's visit. She did not mention the locked door or the Sunday deadline. She wrote only what was legally material, in the clear and orderly way her mother had taught her, and she signed it with her full name. Then she sat and thought about how to get it out of the house. The answer came at 2:30 in the form of a knock at her bedroom door. Not the confident knock of Catherine or the hesitant tap of the housemaid. A small, specific knock, 3 short and 1 long, that Vivienne recognized from a game she had played years ago with the daughter of her father's cook. She opened the door. Meg was 17 now, and no longer the cook's daughter. She was an undermaid, had been for 2 years, assigned to the back rooms and the grates and the kind of work that made her invisible to everyone in the house above a certain social altitude. Vivienne had, over the years, done small things for Meg without making a production of them, noticed when she was unwell, arranged for a doctor's visit once when the housekeeper wouldn't, made sure there was extra food at Christmas. She had not done these things to create obligation. She had done them because they were right, and because her mother had taught her that the people who kept a house running were people, which was apparently a more radical position than it should have been. Meg looked at her with the bright, assessing eyes of someone who understood the situation better than her position was supposed to allow. She said she'd heard the keys turn. Vivienne said she had too. Meg said she had an errand she needed to run in the village, personal business. She said it with the careful neutrality of someone offering a door without pushing it open. Vivienne held out the letter. She said she needed it to go to Carwick House. She said it was to be given to the Duke's secretary directly, not left with a servant. She said Meg should say only that it required the Duke's personal attention and that it was from Miss Ashford. Meg looked at the letter. Then she looked at Vivienne with an expression that was not quite a smile, but contained all the elements of one. She said she'd always thought Sir Reginald had very small hands for a man of his consequence. Then she tucked the letter inside her apron and went downstairs. Vivienne spent the remainder of the afternoon in her room. She read. She wrote in her journal. She moved the Bible from the trunk to the inside pocket of her winter coat, which was hanging in the wardrobe and which no one had any reason to examine. She ate the supper that was brought up on a tray, Catherine maintaining the performance of normality even while conducting a siege, and sat by the window as the light went and watched the road. She did not know if the letter would reach him. She did not know if it reached him, what he would do with it. She knew only what she had put in it, the facts, clearly stated, without appeal or embellishment. She had not asked him for anything. She had informed him of a legal situation that concerned his estate as much as her own, and she had signed her name, and she had sent it through the only door that was still open. Whether he walked through, it was not something she could control. She had learned, over the course of her life, to focus her energy on the things she could control and to make peace with the things she couldn't. She had gotten quite good at this. She had occasionally, in her darker moments, wondered whether she had gotten too good at it, whether the composure she had cultivated as a survival mechanism had calcified into something that looked like acceptance when it wasn't. She thought about a man who had arrived at a dinner party with a purpose and left without accomplishing it. She thought about a letter that had not been answered, which she now suspected had not been received. She thought about a claim left unpressed for 3 years, and a glass set down with particular care, and a coat put on in some haste on a Tuesday morning. She thought about all of it and permitted herself, for exactly as long as the candle took to burn down 1 inch, to hope. Then she put the candle out and went asleep. The letter reached Carwick House at 4:15. James Alderton was in his study when his secretary brought it in, and he read it standing up, which was not his habit, because he had seen Vivienne's name on the outside and had not wanted to sit down first. He read it twice. Then he set it on the desk and stood very still for a moment with his hand flat on the paper. Then he called for his coat. His secretary, appearing in the doorway with the careful expression of a man accustomed to his employer's composure, and therefore alert to deviations from it, asked whether he should also send for the solicitor. James said yes, tomorrow morning first thing. Tonight, he said, he was going alone. He did not go that night. He got as far as the stable, coat on, horse ready, the cold November air sharp against his face, and stopped. He stood there for a moment with his hand on the horse's neck, and made himself think rather than move, which was more difficult than it should have been for a man who prided himself on methodical decision-making. If he arrived at Ashford House at 8 in the evening demanding to see Vivienne, he would accomplish several things simultaneously. He would confirm to Lord Ashford that his interest was personal and therefore manageable, that this was a matter of sentiment rather than legal consequence, which would immediately reduce his leverage. He would give Reginald Holt, who was almost certainly still in communication with the household, advance warning that something was happening. He would give Catherine Ashford time to prepare a response, move documents, or do whatever it was she did when her arrangements were threatened. And he would arrive angry, which he was, underneath the thinking, a cold and thorough anger that he recognized as the kind that made men do things that were satisfying in the moment and counterproductive in every other sense. He took his hand off the horse. He went back inside. He spent the evening at his desk with his solicitor's most recent correspondence. his own estate records, and a glass of brandy he did not drink, building the case with the same methodical patience he applied to everything except, apparently, the contents of Vivienne Ashford's letters. By midnight, he had what he needed. By 6 in the morning, he was dressed. By 8, he was in his solicitor's office, which his solicitor, a phlegmatic man named Mr. Grantham, who had served the Alderton estate for 22 years, accepted with the equanimity of someone who had learned not to be surprised by the Duke's hours when he had made a decision. They talked for 90 minutes. Mr. Grantham confirmed what Vivienne's letter had outlined, that the promissory note was fraudulent, that the receipt rendered it void, that Lord Ashford had pledged an asset he had no legal right to pledge against a debt that no longer existed. He confirmed that the Duke's own estate records contained the original receipt, filed, he said, with the precise organizational habits of the late Duke's secretary, who had been extremely thorough. James said he knew. Mr. Grantham looked at him over his spectacles and said, carefully, that he had wondered. James said he had been waiting for the right moment to address it. Mr. Grantham said, with the neutral professionalism of a man paid not to have opinions, that the right moment appeared to have arrived. James said it had. He told Mr. Grantham what he wanted to do, in what order, and with what degree of legal formality. Mr. Grantham listened, made notes, asked 2 clarifying questions, and then said that it was all entirely achievable and that he would have the relevant documents prepared by noon. James said he needed them by 11. Mr. Grantham said he would have them by 11. He arrived at Ashford House at 11:30 on a Saturday morning. He came in his formal carriage, which he did not always use, because the formal carriage made a statement before anyone opened a door. He came with Mr. Grantham beside him and a document case on the seat across from them, and the particular settled quality of a man who has decided exactly what he is going to do and has no remaining doubts about any of it. The door was opened by the housemaid, young, nervous, clearly aware that something was happening in the house and unsure what, and James gave his card and asked to see Lord Ashford immediately. He was shown to the drawing room. He did not sit. Lord Ashford appeared 4 minutes later with the slightly flustered quality of a man interrupted at something he would prefer not to have been found doing. He was courteous. He was always courteous, James had observed, in the way of men who used courtesy as a management tool. He expressed pleasure at the visit. He gestured toward chairs. James said he preferred to stand, and that this was a business call. Something shifted in Lord Ashford's expression, a minute recalibration, the social warmth dialing back to reveal the calculation underneath. James said he wished to discuss the promissory note dated 3 years prior, pledging the property known as Marsh Cottage and its associated acreage as collateral against a debt to the Carwick estate. Lord Ashford said that was a matter he had every intention of resolving, that the situation had been temporarily complicated by. James said he was not finished. Lord Ashford stopped. Mr. Grantham opened the document case. James said that his estate's records contained a receipt, signed by his father's solicitor, confirming full repayment of the debt in question, dated 14 months before the death of Lady Ashford. He said that this receipt had been in his estate's possession since his father's death. He said that the promissory note Lord Ashford had subsequently signed, pledging the same property against the same debt, was therefore fraudulent, that Lord Ashford had pledged an asset against an obligation that did not exist. The drawing room was very quiet. Lord Ashford's face went through several stages in rapid succession: surprise, calculation, and then a particular blankness that James recognized as the expression of a man deciding how to play a hand he had not expected to be called on. He said there had clearly been some administrative confusion, that the records must have been. James said there was no confusion. He placed the receipt on the table between them. He placed beside it a copy of the promissory note. He placed beside that a letter from Mr. Grantham outlining, in formal legal language, the precise nature of the fraud and the options currently available. Lord Ashford looked at the documents. He did not touch them. Mr. Grantham said, in the mild and inexorable tone of a solicitor delivering an assessment, that the matter could be pursued through several channels, that the most straightforward would involve the formal dissolution of all financial arrangements made on the basis of the fraudulent pledge, including any contractual agreements entered into by third parties on the strength of it. He said this last part with particular clarity. Lord Ashford understood what third parties meant. James saw him understand it. There was a silence. Then Lord Ashford said, with the remnant of his social ease diminished now, threadbare, but still present, because it was the only thing he had left, that he was sure some arrangement could be reached, that he was prepared to discuss reasonable terms, that this sort of thing was best handled between gentlemen, quietly, without. The door opened. Catherine Ashford appeared in the doorway, took in the scene, the documents on the table, Mr. Grantham's document case, her husband's expression, and went very still. James looked at her. He said pleasantly that he was glad she was here as it saved time. He said he was aware of the arrangement she had made with Sir Reginald Holt regarding the management of Miss Ashford's cooperation with the engagement. He said he was aware because Sir Reginald, when contacted by Mr. Grantham's office that morning with a summary of the legal situation regarding the fraudulent pledge, had responded with the instinct of a man protecting himself by immediately redirecting attention to others. He said the letter Sir Reginald had sent in response was, if anything,